Chapter 1: Guerrillas and Mediums. By the mid-1960s, all of Britain's former African colonies had achieved independence. The one exception was Rhodesia. The obstacle that prevented Rhodesia from joining the modern post-colonial world was the refusal of its government to extend to the majority of its citizens the right to vote in national elections. As long as the Shona, the Ndebele, and the other smaller ethnic groups were unable to vote their own leaders into power, a negotiated independence was impossible. In 1965, as an act of defiance of the government of Britain, the Rhodesian Parliament issued an Unilateral Declaration of Independence, UDI, together with a clutch of promises and guarantees that power would remain in the hands of the tiny white minority for all time to come. Over the next few years, international economic sanctions were imposed against Rhodesia, but Britain, whose colonial authority had been flouted, took no direct action at all. The nationalist opposition within Rhodesia, however, did not wait long to respond. Within 1 year, the first armed attack on the Rhodesian state since the 1896 rebellion took place. It was carried out near the town of Sinoya by a small group of guerrillas belonging to the Zimbabwe African National Union, ZANU. The guerrilla war had begun. In 1979, 14 years after UDI, independence with majority rule was finally achieved. The first meeting in the valley. Early in 1971, a small band of ZANU guerrillas crossed from Mozambique into the northeastern corner of Zimbabwe. After a few days in the densely wooded scrubland of the Zambezi Valley, they were led into the village of an ancient female spirit medium. Her name was Kunzarua. The name of her spirit was Nehanda. Comrade Meya Urimbo was the leader of the group. He has described this medium as a small woman, very thin and very old, with white hair and skin that was exceedingly black. She was dressed in a piece of black cloth that was wrapped around her body, and she wore bangles, some of them gold, on her wrists, and other ornaments around her neck. Her skin was dry and cracked with age, and dung was regularly rubbed on to protect it from the sun. When the author talked to Urimbo in 1980, he asked him how he and his guerrillas had met this medium and how she had helped them. He answered, "When we arrived in the area, we had to start by talking to the masses. We spoke to the old people who said we must consult the mediums. We were taken to Nehanda. She was very old. She never bathed and ate only once or twice a week. Her food had to be ground with a mortar and pestle. She hated all European things. We told her, 'We are the children of Zimbabwe. We want to liberate Zimbabwe.' She was very much interested. She knew very much about war and the regulation of war. She said, 'This forest is very, very difficult for you to penetrate.' But she gave us directions. She told us what kind of food to eat, which routes to take, what part of the forest we were not allowed to stay in or sleep in, where we were not allowed to fight. She said we were forbidden to go with girls, and she taught us how to interpret many signs in the forest, which would allow us to live safely and know when our enemy was near." In the years that followed, the guerrillas in the Zambezi Valley met and lived with a number of other mediums. Many of these, such as Chiwawa, Musuma, Mutota, and Madzomba, will play a large part in the pages that follow. But the first that they met with was known as Chipfene. This medium was a short man, powerfully built and bearded like most male mediums. About 40 years old, He was usually dressed in a sky blue toga-like cloth. I spent a day with him in November 1981 at his present home on the Misengezi River, near the border with Mozambique. We sat in the shade on the rich soils on the bank of the river, and he told me how time after time he had gone into battle with the guerrillas, always in the front line. Unarmed but protected by his spirits, he had survived the entire war without injury. One of the district commissioners who had the responsibility of this part of the country in the early days of the war described Chipene to me as a sort of phantom. He had received countless reports of his exploits, but never caught so much as a glimpse of him. A reward had been offered for his capture or death, but it was never paid out. Chipene led the first party of guerrillas to two other mediums, Chiodza Mamera and Chijgamauyu. Chijgamauyu, the youngest of the three, was charged with the care of the old medium of Nehanda. Chiodza Mamera, his senior by 10 or 12 years, had been a school teacher at the Evangelical Alliance Mission in the town of Banket when the illness that announced his possession by Mondoro's spirit first struck. Today he is perhaps the most widely respected medium in Ande. Much of the detail of the life of a Mondoro medium contained in this book I learned from him. The guerrillas intended that these four mediums who had given them their support should travel and live with them. None of the first group of guerrillas came from the northeast. The mediums would explain to the villagers that the guerrillas were from Zimbabwe and were not foreigners from Mozambique or Zambia. They would tell them why the guerrillas had come and assure them that they had their interest at heart. They agreed to advise the guerrillas on the safest routes to carry weapons through the Zambezi Valley and up to the plateau, and to provide medicines to protect them in battle and to cure the wounded. But in 1972, the buildup of guerrillas in the Zambezi Valley was discovered. Government helicopters and ground troops began to patrol, searching them out. The three male mediums could easily vanish behind the camouflage of the shoulder-high trees and the mile upon mile of identical spindly gray trees. But the medium of Nehanda was feeble and weak. Fearing that she would be captured and punished for the support she had given them, the guerrillas decided to take her out of the country. At first, the aged medium refused to go, preferring to remain in the thick of the fighting. But eventually she agreed and was carried on a stretcher to the Zambezi River. Together with her three companions and aides, she crossed into Mozambique, spent 2 weeks resting at Papai in Tete province, and then moved to a camp at Chifombo on the Mozambique-Zambia border, where they remained for 8 months. During this period, according to Urimbo, the medium was doing her command work, directing us in Zimbabwe. Chijgamauyu put it this way: Vaititungamirira muhondo yerusununguko. She led us in the War of Liberation. In mid-1973, the medium of Nehanda died. Her spirit had directed that she should be buried in Zimbabwe, but the war made this impossible. Instead, her followers chose a site at the side of a road used by guerrillas on their journey into Zimbabwe. She was carried to the grave, covered in a white cloth, and buried like a chief on a wooden platform sunk in the earth, surrounded by a hut built and thatched in a single day. Throughout the war, the surviving mediums were joined by others and continued to work hand in hand with the guerrillas, either in the camps in Mozambique or guiding insurgents into Zimbabwe and leading new recruits out. After the war, Urimbo, now National Political Commissar of ZANU-PF and a member of parliament, completed the story of Nehanda. Her house is still there, he says. Fire comes and goes, but it will never burn. When we crossed into Zimbabwe, we put our weapons there and praised the ancestors and said, "We are going to liberate Zimbabwe."